McKinsey's automotive and assembly practice globally. Please welcome Senior Partner Harald Deubener. Did I get it? Yes. Welcome, Harald.
Hello everyone, it is such an honor to be here with you today in Munich. It is wonderful to see so many familiar faces from across the industry. That truly speaks to the power of IAA, and congratulations to VDA for organizing such an amazing event again and again. I'm here today to talk about a new era for the automotive industry in Europe. An action plan that is required for the industry that we all love so much. As the Chancellor highlighted his opening remarks, the industry has been nothing short but remarkable for Europe in multiple dimensions. I can also see a lot of excitement in the air. The Chancellor is about to begin his tour of the IAA, and I'm sure many of you are eager to see the wonderful vehicles, innovations here as well. But we must also acknowledge that the rules of success have changed for the industry. And we must also acknowledge that the industry is likely today facing what might be its largest challenge in history. And I'm here today to talk about an action plan, steps that are required to move forward. And one thing is clear, there is nothing that the industry can tackle alone. It requires all of us. It requires OEMs, it requires suppliers, and it requires governments. But let me walk you through step by step. What I'd like to do in the next minutes is to share, number one, the importance and contributions of the industry in Europe. Number two, the challenges that we see. And number three, most importantly, what is the action plan going forward that needs to happen? Well, let me start with the first one. As we said earlier, the industry has been a powerhouse in multiple dimensions. Let me walk you through a few of them. Prosperity and growth. The European automotive industry is contributing 1.2 trillion in GDP to Europe. That is 7% of the European GDP, of the total economic output of the European Union. It is a recognized world leader of 177 billion in exports by companies gathered in that room here today. Employment, 14 million jobs in the auto industry. That is 6% of the total employment in Europe. There are also 3.5 million jobs in manufacturing. That's close to 9% of all manufacturing jobs in Europe. These jobs make an important contribution to economic stability and the standards of living in Europe. Innovation, that's the part that I'm most excited about. While the industry has quote-unquote only 6 or 7% of GDP or employment, it has 30% of all research and development in Europe. It's the largest private sector in Europe investing into research and development, over-indexed against any other industry that we see. And finally, we talk about the multiplier effect. Every euro invested into the industry has a multiplier effect of 2.6 in other parts of the value chain. We have 17,000 Tier N suppliers in Europe, 17,000. So while the industry can and should be proud about the achievements, at the same time we have to recognize the challenges that we see out there. And let me also walk you through some of these challenges that we see and of what is happening, the headwinds that we see. Number one is around boundary conditions. We have to admit that the boundary conditions in Europe are just not in place. Energy costs are 2x the energy cost in Europe versus US or China. Manufacturing is becoming importantly way more expensive than we expected. The costs of capital are 10% higher in Europe than what we see in China. But while we must talk about the boundary conditions, it would be far too easy to say that that is the only reason. The competitiveness of the industry itself is another important factor. And we have to acknowledge that while the traditional approach is to develop a car in 4 years, We have seen examples in other parts of the world where that happened within 2 years. And we have seen 2x lower the cost base than what we see here. And that is affecting European OEMs on a global market level. I'll talk more about that in a minute because it's an important part. And it is affecting valuation and profitability. 4 out of the 5 largest European OEMs issued profit warnings in 24. The market cap of the 10 largest companies, both OEMs and suppliers, have dropped by 71 billion since 2015. So we must talk about that, of what is happening. Market dynamics are shifting. And I think that simple chart explains what is happening pretty simple. While the European OEMs in the years from 2000 to 2009, 2020, on average had a global market share somewhere between 30 to 33%. That line dropped in the last 3 years now. While Chinese OEMs and tech companies were the lower single-digit numbers in 2000, the lines went up. In 2024, the market share of European OEMs and Chinese and tech players have crossed at 24%. In 24, the lines have crossed at 24%. On a separate note and not focus on the discussion today, US incumbents went from 27% down to 10%. But again, not focus of our discussion today. If we look at the battery electric side of things, you see that the market dynamics are shifting even more. 71% of global market share coming out of Chinese and tech OEMs. While market share is important, there's another factor that we have to, as I said, the GDP in Europe, 7%, dropped 6%. And while we all admire and think it's the right piece to move forward in the electric part, we have to be transparent about the economic consequences. And I think 4 numbers explain that what is happening pretty simple. And these 4 numbers are 90%, 75%, 55%, and 20. 90, 75, 55, 20. And that is the value add that takes place in Europe on average for a European vehicle. So I'll give you an example. A European OEM on average producing a ICE in Europe has 90% of the value add in Europe, basically sourcing some components out of Asia. That value drops by 15 percentage points to 75. If we talk about a European BEV, still a strong value, but 15% lower. Sourcing of battery, power electronics coming out of Europe. If we go one step further and talk about a non-European BEV, in Europe it's 55% because R&D and G&A takes place outside of Europe. And the same is true for even more components. A imported battery electric value has only 20%. That's sales and after sales. No other value add takes place than in Europe. And the rest is simple math. If you multiply the increase of BEVs from 50% today to 100% in 35 by the market share shifts that we've seen before, times these 4 numbers, 1/3 of the automotive GDP is at risk. And that could translate into an additional 1.3, 1.4 million jobs with risk. So that's the task. And it also says in that do-nothing scenario that we have to move forward with a coordinated action plan to move into the right direction. What we envision for the transition of the European auto industry is being successful across 3 dimensions. Successful economics, that's the core, that's the basis of everything. We need financial stable organizations that can fund the transition from ICE to software-defined vehicles and battery-powered vehicles. That is an important piece also to protect GDP and jobs. Successful decarbonization to achieve net zero by 2050, and also a successful reliant value chain that is not dependent on agnostic shocks and other paths that we see. So let me shift gears and walk you through the different elements of the action plan, of the master plan, of the things that we believe need to happen going forward. It has 3 different layers. Layer number 1 is about the part that the automotive companies itself have to do, the transformation. The second layer is where we believe OEM suppliers and governments need to work together. That is a part where industry forces will not solve it alone. And the third piece about we need to have a level playing field to ensure global competition. To share some of these examples, The OEMs will continue, they have to continue to bring 350 new xEVs to the market until 2032. That's 40 to 50 vehicles per year. Need to be 20% and sometimes 50% cheaper in the development. And we also, in the current environment, hardly see such a thing as a global auto market. We believe there are 3 to 4 regionalized markets with the US, with Europe, with China, and further important markets like Korea, Japan, India, you name it. In that second layer, where the industry needs to work together, we have to talk and focus on, and I'll talk about more than a second, 7 future European technology fields. Semicon, SDV, you name it. Due to the individual importance, we also have to talk about the battery production. We need 700, I'll talk about more about also in a second, 700 gigawatt hours of battery capacity by 2030. And we need to make sure that we have a supply chain for 14 critical materials, raw earth, batteries, motor magnets, measure. A level playing field is another important piece, the infrastructure that we talked about. We heard that earlier in the morning as well, charging infrastructure. Navigate the path to net zero is an alternative to the ICE by 2035. I'll talk about that as well, and close 6 major structural gaps. So all in all, an ambitious plan that needs to happen. There's time to act is now. So let me walk you through and explore some of them and bring them to life and what we see is happening. The first piece is about the battery electric pipeline that we see. That is what is in the market today. What you see what is happening are 350 new EVs being launched until 2032. 350 versus 200 hybrids and ICE. So clearly exceeding. We see some of them rightfully so for lower emissions allowance. That is something that the OEMs have to burn. That's 40 to 50 vehicles on average in Europe. That requires 150 billion annual R&D and CapEx split roughly 50-50. And that probably also means that the OEMs have to continue with 7 to 9% R&D quota and investment versus the traditional 5%. That's going to be a decade of continued high R&D spending that we see going forward. The second step in the master plan is about that we have to improve the cost position in Europe as well. And as I said, we've seen examples, sometimes 20 to 50% in both in time. That requires all. That requires product, process, and structural improvements as well. Just to share a few examples on the product side, product design, LFP versus NMC batteries, integrated chassis, X-in-1 on the e-powertrain side. So they're important parts that happen. Also on the development process, like coming from the traditional approach with 12 months of concept development, 18 months of serial development, and then another 18 months of industrialization and testing. There are examples where that works in 20 months. It's tough, but it's possible. Also on the process side and the manufacturing, things like gigacasting or unboxed. So there is an important piece to improve the cost position going forward in Europe as well. I mentioned that earlier, there is an important second layer where we believe there's something the industry alone or the OEMs alone will not be able to tackle that. We believe there are 7 strategic future technology fields in the industry that we need to and have to play an important part in. Let me walk you through some of them. Software-defined vehicles are becoming, in fact, they are already a key differentiator. We believe and see that some OEMs have 40% of their R&D capacity of software engineers. We also believe that the industry would benefit from a common open source middleware technology stack. So software-defined vehicles is important. Semiconductors, we believe, and we had the debate 2 years ago, that the semicon demand will rise by an additional 25% in auto until 2030. But Europe has only 10% of the front-end capacity and 1% of the back-end capacity. So we have to think through, particularly on the front-end capacity, to improve their in production. You might be surprised to see ICE components on their list as well. We believe it is an important part. Even in 2035 with the ICE ban, there's a 100 billion global market for ICE components. And leading that, having stable industrial cash flows, helping other parts of the world also to decarbonize will be important. And finally, let me mention that circularity. If we assume, and that's what we see, that by 2040, 1 out of 2 batteries could be manufactured with recycled material, that is an important industry. Let's not be late to that. Let's think about ramping up the infrastructure and the industry that Europe can play an important part in circularity and in recycling, better recycling going forward. As I said earlier, due to its importance, the battery value chain deserves an individual discussion. And I think that chart pretty much says it all. The blue European box has hardly been recognized on the chart. If we look at the battery value chain, all the way from mining upstream to recycling,